is Bean to Barstool, a podcast that looks at the intersections of craft beer and craft chocolate. My name is David Nilsson. I'm a professional beer writer and an advanced cicerone, and the creator and host of this show. The music for this episode is by my dear friend, indie folk musician Anna P.S. You can find out more about Anna's music in the show notes or at her website, annapsmusic.com. You can find links and information about our guests in the show notes as well. I hope you enjoy this episode of Bean to Barstool. Max Gandy, better known in the craft chocolate world as Dame Cacao, was one of the first chocolate educators I started following on Instagram many years ago now when I was first getting into the scene. With her Dame Cacao website and various podcasts over the years, she's been a calm and knowledgeable voice within craft chocolate for nearly a decade now. She's also incredibly well-traveled and has spent time at many cacao origins. Having Max on the podcast is long overdue, so I reached out to her recently to rectify that wrong. In our conversation, we discussed her journey within craft chocolate, the way going to origin can change our perspectives on chocolate, and what has to happen for the general public to come around to craft chocolate. We also spent some time discussing cacao liquors and other alcoholic beverages made by farmers in different regions. Listen in as we learn from Max. Well, Max, thank you so much for joining me today. At the outset here, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do in the world of craft chocolate?
Sure. Thank you for having me, David. So my work has mostly been under the somewhat pseudonym Dame Cacao, or Dame Cacao, as it was originally created in 2015 when I started the site. That has been my main work in this space, has been working on interviews and chocolate travel guides and just deep dives into different topics around chocolate and cacao for the last 8 or 9 years. But from 2018 to 2021, I also had a podcast called Chocolate on the Road. The pandemic kind of sideswiped that in a big way. And it kind of petered off over the course of 2021 as we realized things were not just going to get back to normal. Beyond that, I started the site originally with reviews. I posted over 200, and almost all of them have been culled over the years because very specific bars, as you know, change so much, even when using the same origin over the years. So things just didn't stand on their own as well 5, 6, 7, 8 years later.
Sure.
So the site is my main project at the moment.
So you've been doing that for almost a decade then. What got you into craft chocolate originally?
When I was 16, I went to a chocolate tasting in Palo Alto around San Francisco at the, unfortunately now closed, Chocolate Garage, run by Sunita de Torre, who is a fantastic chocolate educator. She stepped back from the space at the moment, but she was working under her brand of the Chocolate Garage from around 2010 to 2018. So it felt like she'd been pretty established. But when I came in for a tasting one day in 2012, it was actually pretty early on in her journey, but she was doing tastings around the region for like the likes of Google and Facebook. And I remember the first bar I had actually ended up being a bar that was pretty local to me, Potomac Chocolate. And Ben, the owner and founder and still kind of solopreneur of Potomac Chocolate, is over in Occoquan, which is like 30 minutes or so from me in DC. And I had his Salt and Nibs bar from Costa Rica. And it was, I mean, there were so many flavors. It was just nothing like anything I'd ever had before. I think it's now a pretty common refrain to hear people speak about chocolate in that way. It's like having boxed wine and then trying a $100 bottle that's actually well made. And they're badly made $100 bottles, but it's just such a drastic difference. And I ended up going back I was doing a college program over the summer, so I ended up going back every Saturday, and about 10 weeks or so in a row. And I wrote a paper on this third space that was created for by the Chocolate Garage for one of my anthropology classes. And I ended up keeping in touch with Sunita when I went back to school and when I went on to college. And Um, when I started the site in 2015, it was actually just before I went off for a summer and semester in Latin America to study cacao and chocolate in Guatemala and then Ecuador and Peru. And it just has evolved from there.
Well, you mentioned that bar from Potomac. I feel like we all have those bars that were kind of those,
Yeah.
those wake up moments for us. Were there others beyond that that were kind of really important to you early on?
Oh yeah, this was the era of Rogue Chocolatier, who unfortunately shut down around 2019, something like that. I think it was just before the pandemic. But Rogue Chocolatier was then only producing maybe a couple hundred bars per batch. And Sunita was one of the few people who was able to stock a few different of his origins and retail them, because for the most part he was only doing direct to consumer because the costs were so high. Because back then this was when, for example, Uncommon Cacao was just starting. I think they only had Maya Mountain until maybe 2014. They didn't expand for quite a while. And they had a really long waiting list until around like 2017 or 2018 to even buy some of the cacaos that they were importing. So there were several other brands. I'd say Rogue probably stands out the most, as well as maybe Patrick was another one that she had a lot of different flavors and bars from. His PB&J OMG was one of the first non-single origin fine chocolates that I had. I'm not even sure we called them craft chocolates back then,
Yeah.
but
I
Bean to
feel like
Bar
those
was,
terms have changed over the years
yeah, yeah. The preferred terms have definitely changed.
and are still argued over.
Mm. The exact definitions, yeah. I know the Fine Chocolate Industry Association's working on some kind of standardized glossary at the moment, but it's still under construction.
Well, coming from the craft beer side on in my professional career, which is older, the argument never stops. People can define it. It'll keep getting argued over
Yeah.
and pushed back against. So I feel like with those aha moments, they kind of happen in different stages. You have that first awakening of, that chocolate bar that makes you realize what chocolate can taste like.
Mhm.
Later, then, though, there can be moments where you realize, oh, this is going to be a bigger part of my life. Was there a moment for you where you
Yeah.
realized this was going to become a much bigger part of what you did?
When I went to college and I started to try and figure out what I wanted to do as my profession, as my career, as the 9 to 5, I realized I didn't want a more traditional 9 to 5. I wanted to work in something I felt passionate about, that kind of secondary awakening a lot of people have in college of, oh, I can do something that I really enjoy. I don't have to do some kind of not necessarily dead end job, but I don't have to become a CPA like my dad or a lawyer or a doctor. Like I can do something I really enjoy and make a living at it, especially these days. So I decided that I wanted to work with cacao farmers in Latin America. And I started to study Spanish, and I'd already been studying it for years, but in the way that people take high school Spanish, not so seriously.
Mhm.
And then when I was actually traveling and I had to use my Spanish all the time, I realized how much a portion of being able to work in the field that could be if I wasn't able to communicate. So I think I realized how much more complicated it would be to find a job just working in the industry, and that I wanted to figure out a way to make my own path in a way. There weren't that many people talking about what was going on in chocolate and cacao. That's kind of where I found my first audience, was people who were curious about this and were kind of only finding information from either the one or two cacao origins who had any kind of online presence, or the chocolate makers, of which there were not that many at the time, in terms of bean to bar at least. So I found this kind of middle of the road area that I could fulfill this need for. So it's I don't know, it's been interesting finding out what the best role for me to play is in the industry. And as you're saying, things always change and people are always arguing one way or the other about how something should be defined. That's kind of how I've evolved over the last 8 or so years.
What do you think your role in the industry is going forward?
I think it's probably a similar place insofar as somewhere in between the cacao origins and the chocolate makers, and communicating all of that information to the audience, which both parties serve. But the way that websites, even social media has changed over the last 8 years is profound and so much more important than we're realizing. So I think my role as a voice to share all of this information with people is the same, but the ways and the speed and the amount to which I'm sharing will, I think, continue to change and evolve as people's needs change.
Sure. Who are the makers that are keeping you excited about chocolate right now?
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, Final Gravity Issue 5 is now available in the shop on beantobarstool.com. This 5th issue of our zine telling personal, human-centered stories from the world of beer is full of great articles. Bono Segudu tells the story of the South African beer style Umkombothi, poignantly explaining its role in her culture and the importance in her family's celebrations and milestones. Maria Krugliak writes about discovering the Portuguese half pint after moving to Portugal during the COVID-19 pandemic. Amanda Bruns and Obakeng Malope discuss the water spirit Mamuhaswa and the collaboration beer they brewed in her honor. These and numerous other stories fill the 56 pages of this zine. We've expanded it and added a few features for this issue. It's full color, full of lots of beautiful photography and art. Definitely check this out. It's on beantobarstool.com/shop. You can purchase this issue or subscribe, and you can always support us on Patreon and get extra perks as well. Cheers.
I've been a huge fan of Fioc for years.
Mhm.
I finally met one of the co-founders in February 2020 at Chocoa, and she was so sweet. I got to try most of their other aspects of their line as well. I really like how they work with a few different origins and they keep their single origin line alive, but they also do really interesting things to keep both their customers and I'm sure themselves entertained and interested in all of their new flavors. But they have white chocolates, milk chocolates, dark chocolates, a lot of different flavored bars. Will be like the third or fourth Christmas in a row where I get my dad a brown butter or brown cheese milk chocolate bar made with one of my favorite origins, the Haiti pizza.
Mhm.
Also one of my favorite bars, but he is very picky. So the fact that this has stayed his favorite chocolate bar for about 4 years now is pretty impressive. But I would say Fioc is one of them. Castronovo as well, on a somewhat different scale. I think Denise, I believe, is the owner. I think she's still also similar to Ben at Potomac, a solopreneur. I would say Ben is also a really great example of someone keeping himself as well as his customers entertained in the chocolate industry, because although he doesn't still make that nibs and salt Costa Rica bar that first got me to fall in love with chocolate, he does do gelato at his shop. He's just about to start a pizza venture, a pizza pop-up. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it will ever intersect with the chocolate, but he does chocolate caramel sauces and bonbons at his shop. So he keeps things interesting for his customers and himself in a way that I think would be much harder for a big business like Omnom, for example, in Iceland, to be able to pivot in that way. And they have their own kind of resources, and Omnom is also very interesting kind of in a similar way to fioc, that Scandinavian vibe of
Hmm.
these herbs, these botanicals that we don't necessarily associate with chocolate, but somehow blend so well. Naive, another one.
Oh, yeah, all great makers.
Yeah.
Castronovo's white lemon bar was one of those early ones for me that was just eye
Yeah.
opening. Yeah. Well,
I
let's talk
always buy
about.
3 whenever I have the chance.
Yeah, I haven't had it in a little while. I need to get some more,
She
but
doesn't ship over the summer because white chocolate.
yeah, I
I've
generally
tried.
don't even try to order during the summer. It's just,
It's better.
yeah. But we're getting back into the weather where like we can just suddenly open those floodgates and
Best part of fall.
absolutely. Well, let's talk about the tasting experience itself. Talk to me a little bit about your process, not the mechanics necessarily, but if you're going to sit down to enjoy chocolate, put us in the headspace that you're going to be in for that.
So I actually was in Nashville a few weeks ago visiting my aunt, and they bought a bunch of chocolate from Olive and Sinclair, a maker down just a mile or two from them in Nashville. And they asked me to do a little tasting with everyone. And my mom put all of the bars in the opposite order of what I would have put. So I like to start with the darkest bars. I like to start with a clean palette and preferably a big glass of water next to me so that I can break off a piece. If it has inclusions of any kind, I try to avoid them at first and just take a small bite, not too tiny, but just enough to let it melt in your mouth. And if there's nibs or salt or anything, the salt usually kind of melts with the chocolate, but the nibs you can let stay in your mouth for a little bit and then crunch on them after maybe 20 or 30 seconds. And I feel like with a really good, I mean, just a well-made chocolate, even 100%, it generally isn't so bitter that even people who would say, I don't really like dark chocolate, would want to spit it out or anything.
Mhm.
So with a really good, for example, their highest, I think was either 75 or 78. So I had to start, despite my mom's layout, with the darkest one, which was a single origin. I think it was a Dominican Republic. And then I had them compare it to the same origin made with candied lemon peel. And so for that one, I had them taste the chocolate that was apart from the candied lemon. So it had been kind of stored in a way with the candied lemon, and see how that lemon oil sitting basically stored with the chocolate for a while, however long it was sitting on the shelves, had affected the flavor of the cacao, even though ostensibly there's nothing extra in that part of the bar where there's not actually pieces of candied lemon. And then I had them try a little piece with the candied lemon.
Very
So
cool.
step by step, I
Yeah,
would say.
for sure. If you're going to sit down just for yourself, just for enjoyment and taste a chocolate bar, is there anything particular you do to kind of put yourself in the right mindset for that or kind of, set the scene?
Not necessarily. I think that after, as you said, over a decade of tasting chocolates, there's not much I haven't tasted in a bar. And I feel like other than having, no music, no TV, no outside forces affecting how I'm interpreting what I'm tasting, there's not anything in particular that I do. There aren't any rituals that I do ahead of time to prepare myself for tasting any particular bars.
With that in mind, I think for a lot of seasoned tasters in any field, beyond even beyond chocolate, it can be easy to get kind of jaded to flavors. Like you said,
Yeah.
there's not much you haven't tasted in a bar before. Do you feel like that's true for you, or are there things you do to kind of try to keep yourself fresh or keep yourself excited about this?
At this point, I'll take a week off from tasting any chocolate, especially in the summer, because there is a limit also to how much chocolate I can have at any one time, especially in our house at this point. But I try to taste dark chocolates, single origins preferably, at the beginning of any kind of tasting session. At this point, I'll just nibble on it throughout the day as well. But I try not to taste too many at once, because that's how I feel like you become even more jaded or overwhelmed by the similarities, because I mean, chocolate is still chocolate. Like there are still many more similarities than there are differences between bars.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to be able to appreciate the nuances of any one bar over another or compared to another, I think you can't have more than 3 or 4, maybe 5 over the course of even a day to really be able to appreciate the more subtle natures of some of the bars.
That takes a lot of self-restraint.
It depends. If you don't have as large of a collection anymore, it varies.
Sure. Well, one thing that's been unique for your journey with chocolate, you alluded to earlier, you have done a lot of travel and going to cacao origins. I think for a lot of us who are chocolate fans, at least here in North America, maybe we've never been to an origin, maybe we've been to one. You've been kind of all over the globe. Talk a little bit about some of your travels, and then we'll talk about how that has informed your understanding of chocolate.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned at the top of the show, I first went to Guatemala and then I went to Ecuador and Peru. And in Guatemala, I did go to one cacao farm. Earlier that year, I'd been on a spring break trip to Puerto Rico and insisted that we drive to Ponce to see the one place. I think it was called like Para la Naturaleza, something like that. And there was a cacao tree with 1 or 2 pods on it. And that was the first time I ever saw cacao pods in real life growing on a tree. But then in Guatemala, I mean, I was on the farm for 3 or 4 days and I saw hundreds of cacao trees, and they were primarily growing a criollo. I don't know if it was porcelana, but it was, I just did not know nearly enough about cacao at the time to have any understanding of how to distinguish different varieties of cacao. But I know it was a native criollo variety to that part of Guatemala. But then from Guatemala, I went to Ecuador and I worked on a cacao farm. I unfortunately did not get to see any cacao in Peru, but I worked in a chocolate museum there. So my initial exposure to cacao at origin was in Latin America. But then I moved to Asia for 4 years, starting the next year. And on all of my breaks I was teaching English in South Korea. So all of my breaks from teaching, all of my vacation time was basically dedicated to going to different origins and meeting different interesting people and interviewing them and just trying to understand the differences between the challenges, but also, the different varieties and the tastings and the history, the ways that the cacao got to these different places, even to different farms. Like in Cambodia, all of their cacao comes from Vietnam around the year like 2000. They got almost all of their cacao in Vietnam from Malaysia. And then in Cambodia, I think it was around 2016 or 2017, it might have been a bit earlier, but they got their cacao from Vietnam. So the different ways that cacao has kind of traveled across the globe has varied greatly. Like in the Philippines, cacao arrived in the 16th century, the tail end of the 16th century, brought by the Spaniards from Mexico. So all of the different ways that cacao traveled across the globe just fascinated me and brought me to a lot of different places, as you alluded to.
Yeah. How has that influenced your appreciation of the finished product, getting to see the back end of that and understanding that at origin?
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, my book on pairing craft beer and craft chocolate is available now on Amazon and on the Bean to Barstool shop. Pairing Beer and Chocolate, a guide to bringing the flavors of craft beer and craft chocolate together, is out now. This paperback book explains the process of pairing beer and chocolate, includes a guide to hosting a pairing at home, walks through dozens of beer styles to provide style-by-style pairing guidance, and gives room for taking your own pairing notes along the way. This is the only book on pairing beer and chocolate available. Grab your copy now at the link in the show notes or on Amazon. If you manage a tap room, bookstore, chocolate shop, or cafe and want to stock the book, get in touch about our easy wholesale process. Beer and chocolate belong together, and this book is your guide to getting the most out of every pairing.
For me personally, it's made me understand so much better why a finished chocolate bar is not only worth $10, but is severely undervalued at $1.
Mm.
I say this never having been to West Africa or East Africa, any part in Central Africa where they're growing cacao. I've been to Morocco, but I don't really count that. But most of the cacao that we have in these chocolate bars on shelves, the chocolate candy bars, is, I think, more accurately stated, is from West Africa, is from Ghana, the Ivory Coast. And even there, I know that the amount that farmers are being paid and are earning, are being given basically by the government, because the government dictates what the price is not enough to survive on. So I'd say, even though my experience has not been in Africa yet, just seeing the cacao growing at origin in different parts of Asia and Latin America has given me so much more appreciation for how a bar can get to the price point of $10, or even maybe as low as $5, and still be equitable. But I just cannot understand how a bar can get to like $1 to even $3 and still have any kind of value for the farmer beyond this is a commodity. It's like, if you want farmers to treat the cacao as more than just the fruit that they need to pick and check that task off their list, they need to be compensated for more than just a regular fruit.
What do you think? And obviously, this is a big question that we're not going to solve here, but what do you feel like is the next thing that has to happen to get the general public to understand that?
I mentioned earlier how much social media has changed even over the last 8 years or so, not just the ways that we use the various networks, but which networks people are on. I think people need to revolutionize how they see their food in general. I don't think that chocolate itself will be an industry that people focus on solely. I think it could become a part of people better understanding how the food they put into their body affects people all around the world, like how the choices that they make, like they say, vote with your dollars, how the choices that they make affect how food is grown around the world, how food is even transported to different places, what food is being prioritized, how people are fed. I mean, right now I'm studying for a master's in nutrition, and part of learning about the ways that we nourish our body is understanding how the food that we eat gets to us. So I think before chocolate can really have a revolution or a big change as it needs to, I think people in general need to be better educated and better educate themselves about how all of the food that they consume gets to them, and to prioritize eating better quality food, but also more ethically sourced foods. And not everyone is going to care, but if enough people care, then we can kind of bring the masses along with us to improve our food ways.
Changing subjects, you and I have been having some conversations about cacao spirits, and in particular, the ways that cacao farmers are able to use the pulp of their fruit that would normally be a waste product to make beverages, alcoholic beverages. Talk a little bit, just kind of as an introduction, about some of your experiences with that at Origin.
So the first time that I had cacao liquor of any kind was on the farm in Ecuador. It was a very rough liquor. It was actually just drained from the first day's fermentation, and the owner of the farm did not, unfortunately, know enough about fermentation to really properly be executing on the fermentation, and even the roasting was pretty rough. It was very much a we make chocolate for our cafe in Quito. It's not like being sold anywhere. Like it's turned into hot chocolate. It was a very kind of rough and tumble operation. But even then, I was so impressed by how sweet and almost like strawberry-like this pulp was, because it really changes from when you have the fruit itself. It's like this kind of sweet, fresh flavor. It's generally not super sour. It becomes quite acidic and sour once it's fermented for even a few hours, because the increase in heat, it does something to change the chemistry that really emphasizes, I guess it's the removal of the sugars to ferment them, but it creates a much more kind of sour, generally acidic at that point beverage, which I would not put to market. It needs some kind of further distillation. Uh, Later on in Asia, in different parts of Asia, I tried a few different cacao liqueurs. I think Vietnam has probably the most kind of advanced both interest and infrastructure to create these beverages. That's the only place where I've really seen cacao liqueur for sale and have been able to buy it. But the way that it changes over the course of the first day or two, which is really the only time that you can collect the pulp to be able to turn it into a liqueur that's at all palatable, is pretty interesting. I hope you're able to have someone on who can talk a little bit more about the chemistry, because unfortunately I'm just not as educated about that.
Yeah, with what you're talking about in Ecuador, I wonder if that's just a very rapid lactic fermentation. I mean, especially with those higher
It's possible.
temperatures, lactic bacteria would get to work very quickly.
Oh yeah. It was, yeah, I mean it was the hot season. It was the rainy season. It was July and August
Mm,
in Ecuador.
sure. Looking at Vietnam with the higher prevalence of those liqueurs, is how organized and industrialized is that? Is that like a very small farm driven industry, or is that larger corporations that are capitalizing on that? How does that work?
I will say there is a lot more involvement of East Asian chocolate producers in Vietnam in particular, in Malaysia as well, because it's such a larger cacao producing country. They used to produce, I think there's maybe still in the top 10, at least the top 15, whereas Vietnam is a bit lower on the rung in terms of volume of cacao produced. But there's a lot more involvement of like Lotte Corporation, Meiji. They buy a lot more cacao in Vietnam and Malaysia as well. So I feel like there must be some level of either a local company that's just purchasing this like day one fermentation juice that drips off of the piles, because there were a couple of brands in like smaller towns in central Vietnam that you could just buy from a local shop, but they never had any kind of name on them. Like they were like the Lotte Corporation's cacao liqueur. It's some kind of regional producer that sells nationally, because I've seen it both in central Vietnam and southern Vietnam. But I know that the late Samuel Maruta of Maru, he used to work with his cacao farmers, and every year they would have a cacao liqueur competition.
Oh,
And
cool.
so, yeah, each of the different regions in Vietnam, they used to, and maybe they still do, but compare each of the different liqueurs that they'd produced over the course of that last harvest, and would declare winners and give different awards out and just kind of make it a big party. So I don't know if it's a thing in Vietnam that they just create a lot of different fruit liqueurs, but they certainly create a lot of cacao liqueurs.
I wonder if the urgency of collecting that, like you're talking about, kind of enforces that staying small and local. Like it would be very difficult, it seems like, to organize that into a larger operation with the limited amount of time that's available.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's reflected a lot as well in how popular the cacao juice creations became for a while and then kind of fizzled off, because you really need to have that immediate collection of the pulp, especially if you're going to do a juice that doesn't have any alcohol percentage at all, much less any of that kind of twinge of, as you were saying, maybe lactic acid, that acidity, that sourness that I really start to associate with the liqueur at that point. And I think I would characterize it as a liqueur because I mean, liquors I think of as something that can be distilled. I think the distillation of a cacao liqueur would really ruin the delicate flavors that do remain in the liqueur after it's been fermented, and as you would say, in these kind of local areas in pretty limited quantities. I think it would be really hard to make it a bigger operation unless you're maybe in the midst of just a ton of cacao farms, just surrounded by cacao farms on all sides, so that you could, at the peak of harvest, collect as much of the cacao liquor, of the cacao pulp at once to make it into a liqueur or a liqueur of some kind.
Did you have a chance to taste many of these in Vietnam? And if so, what kind of variation did you see?
I think the sweetness level was the biggest variation, and some of them would have, I hate to say, but a bit of a kind of like paint thinner undertone. I think that maybe comes more from being over fermented, but it has a real echo of the fresh cacao juice, both the juice itself once it's in the containers and has been captured all fresh, and the pulp that you get off of the beans when you just suck on them to enjoy the pulp itself. But it's a lot more flat, like the dynamic kind of light acidity. People compare it to like lychee or strawberry a lot of the time. I always think of it as like a Sour Patch Kid. The delicate flavors are lost a lot of the time. So I think the main difference is definitely the sweetness level, but also that punch of acidity can vary.
I would be fascinated to learn more about the details of that fermentation. Like some of the things you're describing, like that paint thinner, even conventional Saccharomyces can give off some really nasty flavors if it ferments too hot. And I'm wondering if it
Yeah.
just like a little bit more control of the fermentation would address some of that.
And how you could control the fermentation, like especially during that first day, would you want to be turning it more? But if you turned it more so that you could save more of the juice, would that affect then the heat mass that the fermentation was able to reach? Is there an optimal amount of cacao to be putting in that fermentation pile at once in order to collect juice before it's able to, like, if you reach a certain weight, you can get the pressure to a point where you're draining enough of the juice. But yeah, I think you would need to have access to a fair amount of cacao and people who are willing to let you basically ruin their cacao if it comes to that.
So as that juice is running off the cacao, that is just spontaneously fermenting in whatever vessel it's collected in, right?
But yeah, that's the other thing. It's like if you're not somehow otherwise controlling, especially if you're not using a sterilized vessel to capture the cacao liqueur, it will continue to ferment and bubble, and especially in the heat in Ecuador in particular. I mean, it easily got over 95 several days. And I mean, fermentation day was fermentation day. Like if it was hot, it was hot. It was what it was. And if it rained, you hope you got it under the cover fast enough. So some days there was a little extra water in the fermentation tank. And it's hard to say how much that might have affected the final product. I didn't get to taste it every week, but when I did, it was almost always different from how I remembered it.
So interesting. There are a handful of distilled commercial cacao spirits available on the market. Have you had a chance to try any of those?
No, I have not been able to really stomach much alcohol the last few years, so it has not been a pursuit that's been on my list. It's bothered my stomach for the last few years, unfortunately. But I have heard of a couple of them. I think Sol Beso comes to mind.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if they're still operating. I think that was out of Ecuador, but
I believe they are. Yeah.
good.
Yeah, I haven't
Have
had a
you?
chance to try it.
Oh,
There's nowhere near us that stocks it, so I'm hopeful to try it at some point here.
as I'd say, I think you might have to just travel to a couple of different origins to find some. I think there may have been one out of like Nicaragua,
Yeah,
uh,
I know there's some in
Panama.
Brazil.
Yeah, Brazil
Um,
for sure.
yeah, I imagine probably there's some version of this in a lot of Central and South American origins, whether or not it's very commercialized.
Yeah, or able to be commercialized. I mean, I know local laws change and vary, and sometimes it's a regional law, not a national law, and maybe you can't bring it over even a regional border, much less like export it. Maybe there are import laws in the destination. So I know it can vary hugely.
Yeah. Well, last thing I'll ask you, where do you see yourself in the chocolate world in 10 years?
Hopefully still in it. I used to want to become a chocolate maker, and I realized very quickly that there are some fantastic people doing much better than I ever could, and that was not really the role I wanted to play in the industry. I've even gotten rid of my stone grinder. I still have my cacao roaster, which is actually a coffee roaster, from 2016. I assume it still works, but I haven't tried it. But at some point, I would love to have my own chocolate shop or cafe. It's hard to say. I mean, even right now with the housing market, it's unfortunately affecting rentals and the ability to rent out a cafe. And as I mentioned, I'm back in school, so there's a lot going on for me personally. But I'd love to be involved in some way, at least as Dame Cacao, if not as the owner of some kind of shop or part owner of some kind of shop that sells some fantastic bean to bar chocolates.
Well, Max, thanks so much for coming on Bean to Barstool today. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful to talk to you, David.
Thanks to Max for coming on the show today. You can find links to her website and social accounts in the show notes. Thanks to all of you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Bean to Barstool.